This is the third session of the Emerald Ash Borer University's Fall 2024 semester. Today we are hosting Dr. Kayla Perry from Ohio State University, who's going to be talking to us about Elm Zigzag sawfly. Kayla, go ahead and take it from here.
Thanks so much, Bob, for that introduction and the invitation to be here today. I'm excited to talk about Elm Zigzag sawfly, which is expanding throughout the eastern U.S. So today I'm going to give some background on Elm Zigzag sawfly biology and its status in the U.S. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of elm in some of our forests, and then end with some preliminary data from projects that I have ongoing in collaboration with the USDA Forest Service. Okay. Let's see. I get my slide to change. Yes. Okay. So Elm Zigzag sawfly, this is a sawfly species in the family Argidae, and it was first reported in North America, actually in Canada, in Quebec, Canada. The first report was in 2020. And really interesting, this observation was made by a citizen using iNaturalist. If you're unfamiliar with iNaturalist, it's an app or a platform to record biological observations. And so someone recorded an observation of Elm Zigzag sawfly, and then it was later confirmed, the identification was confirmed by Canadian officials. So how and when EZS was first introduced into North America, it is not known, but it is spreading. So it's been found in several US states now, from 2021 to 2024. It's actually been exotic in Europe for some time now, about 2 decades. It was first detected in Europe in 2003 and has been spreading and is considered a pest there. And it's native to East Asia, including Japan, Eastern Russia, Eastern China, and the Korean Peninsula. So here is the current distribution of Elm Zigzag sawfly in the US. This map was created by Kelly Oaten at NC State University. She leads the Elm Zigzag sawfly working group, and it is hot off the press. So this includes 2024 growing season detections and some that just happened like a couple of weeks ago. And so we can see here in this map, our first detection in the US is in Virginia, and that's shown here in red for 2021. The blue star indicates where it was first detected in Quebec. And then in 2022, we had several more detections. That's represented here in the orange, North Carolina, Maryland, Pennsylvania, as well as New York. And then in 2023, we have detections in Ohio, which is where I am, in Vermont, and in Massachusetts. And then most recently, this year, we've had detections in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and then very recently, Illinois and New Hampshire have indicated that they have detected Elm Zigzag sawfly. And so USDA APHIS confirms all of these detections, and they require a physical insect specimen. And so what's represented here are those counties that have detected a feeding damage, but then also have reported the insect, and it has been confirmed, its identification by USDA APHIS. So there are other areas within the eastern US that have identified feeding damage caused by Elm Zigzag sawfly, but there's no insect specimen that's been collected yet. So we've got some more pending locations, and the map will be updated, of course, if and when those reports are confirmed. And to my knowledge, APHIS is not regulating this pest at this time. So we've had many new county detections this past summer. You can see all in the green. And this insect is likely more widespread than this map represents. There are likely many undetected populations, so I expect this map to be updated within the coming years. And so in Ohio, EZS was first detected at the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station Lab in Delaware, Ohio, which is just above Columbus. And this happens to be the location of the American Elm Breeding and Restoration Program, which is on site at the Forest Service Lab. So they have literally thousands of elm trees on site. So it's not surprising that they detected this pest, given it being in the state. So here is a list of the hosts for Elm Zigzag sawfly. So EZS feeds exclusively on the foliage of elm trees. And this includes both native species, native to North America, as well as species that are cultivated in the landscape. And so I've also got a list of locations. And so these are the areas in which we have observed Elm Zigzag sawfly larvae feeding on these different elm species. And so these records from Ohio have come from observations made by Kathleen Knight at the USDA Forest Service and other members of her team at that Delaware lab in their elm tree plantings. And so many observations on American elm. We've also got Siberian and Japanese elm observations within Ohio. So from the name, you might guess, Elm Zigzag sawfly feeds and creates this characteristic zigzag pattern in the leaves, particularly the young larvae. And so they feed from the margin of the leaf in towards the midvein, and they're creating this zigzag feeding pattern, and it occurs all the way through the leaf tissue. And so this feeding pattern on elm is a diagnostic characteristic. However, it is possible to observe this feeding pattern but not find the larvae. And so what we see is that the best way to detect, if you're scouting your elm trees, one of the best ways to detect EZS in the field is by identifying this zigzag pattern, and then from there looking for either the larvae or an adult nearby. And so the larvae, especially in this early instar stage, is very small. And so I find it easiest to see them in the light. They're kind of glossy or dewy compared to the leaf tissue, and you can spot them pretty easily that way. So there is another sawfly species that is native to North America that does create this zigzag feeding pattern. However, it feeds on prunus, so cherry and related species. So if you do see a zigzag feeding pattern on prunus, there's no cause for alarm. This is a native species, and it's not Elm Zigzag sawfly. But I wanted to point this out in case you noticed this feeding damage on other species outside of elm. It could be this. There are also other insects that feed on elm leaf tissue, but you can easily distinguish their feeding patterns from Elm Zigzag sawfly. And so here I have an example of elm leaf miner. And so here the larvae are feeding within the leaf tissue, and they're not creating a zigzag pattern, and they're also not completely feeding through the leaf tissue like EZS does with that zigzag pattern. There's also elm leaf beetle, so elm leaf beetle and also larger elm leaf beetle, that sometimes their feeding can appear zigzagged, but again, does not feed directly through the entire leaf tissue. And so some things to keep an eye out for if you're searching for EZS feeding damage in the field. So I talked about the young larvae producing this zigzag feeding pattern from the leaf margin to the midvein. Well, as the larvae grow, their feeding pattern changes. And so the older larvae are feeding more broadly on the leaf tissue, and they're leaving behind only the thick leaf veins. And oftentimes this feeding will eliminate the zigzag feeding pattern that you're looking for in the field, and is characteristic of this species. So here I've got an example of a larger instar larvae just mowing down a leaf, not feeding in that zigzag shape. There's also one here that is mowing down this leaf as well. And so as larvae are growing, there is the potential to remove significant amount of foliage from these trees, especially when populations are high. And so I just have some photos of what that might look like in the field. And so here's an example of some leaves that have been fed on quite substantially by larger instar larvae. You can see the midvein is left, and also some thicker lateral veins remain. And these are on stems with other leaves that retain their foliage as well. So here's just another photo of that. Again, the midvein remaining. Occasionally there are lateral veins that remain. And then in this case, we actually have a leaf that has very minimal feeding damage. And on the underside are their summer cocoons. And so these Elm Zigzag sawfly larvae were feeding on these adjacent leaves, and then they left this leaf here so that they could form their summer cocoon, pupate, and then emerge as an adult. So I'll talk a little bit more about these cocoons as we cover the life cycle. Okay, so here's a photo of the adult Elm Zigzag sawfly. And so you can see it has a black shiny body. It has these pale yellow legs. It's quite small and has a stout body. And so what's really interesting, in my opinion, about this species is that the adults reproduce parthenogenetically, meaning that the females reproduce asexually. They don't need to mate. And so females are able to emerge. They lay unfertilized eggs that produce only females. And so at this time, there have been no males recorded for this species as of yet. And so here is an example of what Elm Zigzag sawfly egg looks like. Females can lay between 7 to 49 eggs. Some reports have been up to 60 eggs. And they lay these singly along the leaf margin. And so females also do not need to feed before they lay eggs. So they can emerge as an adult and immediately begin laying eggs. And so the larvae will emerge from those eggs and then begin feeding on the elm foliage. So Elm Zigzag sawfly larvae are fairly small, particularly those first instars are very small. They're caterpillar-like, and they're this light green in color. They have some characteristic markings. So on the head, they have this dark band. And then they also have these characteristic T-shaped markings on their second and third legs. And so surprisingly, even though these are very small, these markings on their legs are quite noticeable with their light green body. Okay, and then the larvae will feed for a period of time, 2 to 3 weeks, progressing through 6 larval stages. So they're feeding and they're growing, and then they pupate. So depending upon the time of the year, they may produce a different type of cocoon. So they have these seasonally dimorphic cocoons. So during the summer, they produce this loosely spun net-like cocoon that's often attached to the underside of leaves. I showed that photo earlier. I'm probably going to show it again. Of all those cocoons under that one leaf, here's another example of that. And so they're feeding during the summer, they're progressing through their life stages, and if the temperature is still good, they form this summer net-like cocoon under the leaves. And these, because of their placement, are often more easily observed than their winter cocoons. So here again is that photo I mentioned, where you have a collection of them under this leaf after they've been feeding and developing. So in some cases where heavy defoliation has been observed, these net-like cocoons have been attached to other nearby objects. So that's what this photo is showing. So North Carolina has observed some heavy defoliation in some cases, and I have some photos later of what that looks like. And so they've observed where there aren't any leaves for the larvae to form these cocoons and pupate, and so they'll do it on nearby objects such as fence posts and other human-made structures. And so this could be a mechanism to facilitate long-distance dispersal by humans, potentially. So after pupation occurs, then the next generation of adults will emerge after about roughly 10 days. And so adults are known to be strong flyers. So there's some estimates that they can actively disperse 45 to 90 kilometers per year. And so this high dispersal potential could contribute to their ability to spread throughout the region. So this also suggests that they're able to have, this quick life cycle suggests they're able to have multiple generations within a year. However, what we're seeing and what the literature is reporting is that the number of generations seems to vary across years and also across regions. And so within its native range in East Asia, it's been reported to have 4 generations per year. There are some areas within Europe that have reported 6 generations per year. And so within the US, researchers are still trying to understand how many generations might occur within a year, how that might differ depending upon which area you're in, and what might control this number of generations. And so the parthenogenetic reproduction potential of this species, their strong flight capability as adults, there's a lot of factors here that are troubling and could suggest or favor rapid population growth of this insect. Okay, and lastly, I mentioned there were 2 types of cocoons. And so at the end of the growing season, EZS larvae will produce this winter cocoon. And so it's the overwintering generation that produces this more solid-walled cocoon. And what we see happening is that the larvae are feeding in the foliage. Once it gets to the point where they're ready to pupate, the larvae will drop from the leaves down to the soil. And once they are in the soil, they will dig down and then form this winter cocoon. There is some evidence that the winter cocoons are produced by some subset of the population throughout the growing season. So this sort of bet hedging adaptation where a certain subset of the population is actually producing winter cocoons and going into the soil as this adaptive mechanism in case winter or cold temperatures might come early and they're unprepared. The winter cocoons are more difficult to find because they're in the soil, they're more difficult to observe. And so we know less about this part of their life cycle, but there's much more, of course, to learn. In Ohio, we saw both in 2023 and in 2024 that we couldn't find any more larvae feeding on elm trees by the end of August. And so presumably at this time, they had dropped to the ground and had begun forming their winter cocoons. But when surveying the trees, we still find zigzag feeding patterns. And so there's some proportion of the population that perhaps isn't reaching this stage. And I'll talk more about what might be happening there later. So here's just another photo of one of those winter cocoons. It seems when they're first formed, they're a lighter in color, white or a light beige, and then they darken to brown over time. And so this is just a basic life cycle of this insect, and there are still many factors that we don't understand about their biology, their population dynamics, and their potential impact. Okay. So what you might be thinking is, well, how bad is it going to be? Some good news, some, I don't know, maybe bad or up in the air sort of news. One, this insect doesn't appear to be a tree killer. So we don't have any reports of direct mortality of EZS to killing elm. However, the damage seems to be quite variable. I already mentioned going through the life cycle. There's a lot that we don't know, and a lot of reports that we're getting from different areas are highly variable. So we don't really understand when EZS will cause minimal damage or substantial damage. So sometimes damage is minimal. So this is an example of a tree. So both of these trees are located in North Carolina. These photos are taken by Kelly Oaten at NC State. So this tree here showing minimal damage. So there is some, feeding by Elm Zigzag sawfly, but it's mostly just aesthetic issues. Whereas this tree over here has more defoliation, and it's an example of higher defoliation and greater impact. And what they've been seeing when there is high defoliation is that this typically occurs at the bottom of the canopy and then moves upward. So here are some additional photos provided by Kelly. So these trees are in North Carolina, where we've got partial defoliation of American elm here, as well as winged elm. You can see what that looks like. And then there's also cases where populations are quite high, and there's a lot of evidence of that, in addition to just leaves being eaten from the trees. And so here, this photo Kelly took underneath a highly infested elm tree. And so this was a blacktop driveway. And what you're seeing here are the later instar larvae that were dropping from the tree, and they are trying to burrow into the soil and create that winter cocoon. But of course, they can't burrow into the blacktop, and so they're just left there. And then this really gives you an appreciation of the density of larvae on that tree, and also gives us some insight into their biology and what's happening during this overwintering generation. So heavy defoliation, trees will sometimes put out a second flush of leaves, or they might recover the following season. And so here's an example, also in North Carolina, where this tree, this is the same tree at two different time points. And so early on in the season, it experienced defoliation by Elm Zigzag sawfly, but then later in the fall, it responded by putting out a second flush of leaves. And so trees are able to respond depending upon the level of defoliation and the time of year in which they experience that damage. So while EZS is capable of significant defoliation of elm trees, there's a lot of variability, as I mentioned, that's been reported among locations. And so we don't fully understand what the impact will be across the US. So in Ohio so far, we've reported and observed minimal defoliation. So I just showed you some photos from North Carolina. We're not seeing anything, at least not yet, to that extent, either with the larvae or the defoliation on trees. So in Europe, they've also reported variability, but there are cases where trees have been severely defoliated, and they will produce this second flush of leaves later in the same season or the following year. But what they're finding is that those trees may suffer branch dieback or reduced growth by that response. So generally, these defoliated trees appear to be able to recover from a single defoliation event. But if there are repeated severe defoliation events, whether in the same season or over consecutive years, there's potential that it could weaken the tree or kill the host over time. This is a stress for the tree that could then predispose them to other pests or diseases and result in tree death over time. But we have no reports of EZS directly causing the death of elm at this time. And so really the worry here is that Elm Zigzag sawfly is just another stressor that will further exacerbate the decline of elms in conjunction with other stressors and other threats such as Dutch elm disease. And so elms are really important in floodplain forests, for northern wet forest systems in particularly, So this figure here is showing the successional stages of a northern wet forest. And you can see American elm here is a key species in the later stages of this forest, in addition to ash, which we also know is threatened. And so elm and ash are historically filling a very key niche within these systems due to their tolerance to flooding, their cold tolerance, and also their shade tolerance. And so floodplain forests are really dynamic systems, and they're characterized by this regular disturbance of periodic flooding. We find that these systems are threatened by a variety of factors: climate change, land use change, and of course, invasive species, including emerald ash borer and elm zigzag sawfly. However, these systems provide a lot of ecosystem services, which are very valuable. So they can regulate hydrology, they can affect water quality, and they're also important in sustaining biodiversity. And so elm is already a threatened species due to Dutch elm disease as well as elm yellows. And so adding EZS into this is just an additional concern. And so here is an example of the effects of Dutch elm disease. So it was first introduced in the 1930s. It's a fungal pathogen that's spread by bark beetles. And essentially what we're seeing is that it is affecting the size class of elms within our forest. So this figure is showing number of trees here along the y-axis, and then we've got size class of trees along the x. And so when we go out and survey, more recently, we can see that we're really losing these larger trees due to Dutch elm disease. So this is a threat for elm that's already out in the landscape, and now we've got this additional stressor, EZS. But elm, of course, is an important species in floodplain forests, which I've already discussed, but it's also really important in sustaining wildlife. And so there are a lot of insects and birds that rely on elm and other tree species within these systems. So its early spring seed production provides a food resource for migratory birds. It also supports many insect species, which also support bird species. So birds eat a lot of caterpillars and other lepidopterans that are growing and feeding on trees during migratory season as well. So American elm has a broad geographic range. That's what this map in the center is showing in North America, and particularly in the northern wet ecosystems, it occupies this really unique and important niche. So in terms of management, there's really little information in the literature that focuses on effective options. So there has been some work done looking at efficacy of insecticide options. So Kelly Oaten and her team at North Carolina State University, as well as Kathleen Knight and her team at the USDA Forest Service, they're currently investigating efficacy of imidacloprid. There is some research looking at dinotefuran, and some folks in Virginia found that foliar applications do provide high levels of control. In Europe, they've also explored insecticide applications as an option for control. However, what they're finding is that this high reproductive output of EZS requires yearly management because reinfestation generally occurs. And there's also potential impacts that these insecticides may have on other insects, including predators or native insect species, native herbivores. Okay, and the last aspect here about management that I wanted to discuss is this role of natural enemy communities. So I'm not necessarily talking about biological control, but just native natural enemies within EZS's introduced range. And so we're seeing a lot of variability in impact of EZS, given they have these factors that would indicate quick population growth and substantial impact. And so one of the hypotheses is that there's this control being provided from native predators, and that may be one factor contributing to this variability and impact that we're observing with EZS over space and time. And so there's ongoing research that's exploring natural enemies that may be feeding on EZS larvae or their pupae. Some work has been done in Europe investigating natural enemies. And so there are some records of parasitoid species that are using EZS caterpillars as hosts, as well as lady beetles functioning as predators of EZS larvae. So there's much work still to be done related to management, but some interesting ongoing research. Okay, so I wanted to wrap this presentation up talking about some of the pilot projects that I've been involved with this past summer with EZS in Ohio. So in Ohio, as I mentioned already, EZS was first detected at the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station Lab in Delaware, Ohio, just north of Columbus. And that this happens to be the location of their American elm breeding and restoration program. So they've got thousands of elms in orchards. They've got elms and potted elms on site. They have some legacy plantings. And so they basically identified the feeding damage and then found the insects during some of their regular surveys within these plantings. And so it was found at the lab early June in 2023, and then there was an official identification confirmation by APHIS later in July that same year. So the Ohio DNR, Division of Forestry, is continuing to conduct visual surveys throughout the state for additional symptoms to detect other populations. And I have been collaborating with Kathleen Knight, who is a research scientist with the USDA Forest Service at the Delaware lab, to study some basic biology of EZS on site, and also to investigate predator communities that may be helping to control EZS. And so we had several pilot projects in collaboration with Kathleen Knight and her team that we launched this past summer, monitoring EZS in these plantings. And so the goal here was to collect some data, some preliminary data to help generate questions related to the life cycle, number of generations of EZS, potential impacts that we're seeing in Ohio and elsewhere, and then the role of predators. And hopefully try and get some additional funding with these preliminary data to then support a graduate student and other personnel. So I had a small team of students that made weekly trips this summer down to the Delaware lab. So I'm based in Worcester, Ohio. And so it's like an hour and a half south. So we were there weekly, and we worked with Kathleen's team to collect some data related to monitoring the number of adults throughout the summer, which we use sticky traps, yellow sticky traps, which you can see here. We evaluated a subset of their elms weekly for the presence of larvae and also feeding damage, so trying to track the development and also look at how many generations might be occurring within the site. And then also we surveyed for arthropod predators, again, using yellow sticky traps. And then we also had a subset of trees, very small number, where we followed bagged and unbagged larvae. So we're still working through all of the data that we collected. We're also in the process of applying for some additional funding opportunities to hopefully expand these projects. And so what I have today are just some really simple observations from this summer to give you an idea of what we're beginning to see as we dig down into these data. So first here is a look at adults throughout the summer that we collected off of these yellow sticky card traps. And so here we've got number of EZS adults, and then we've got our sampling dates along the X. And so we had these yellow sticky cards out for 1 week, about 1 week intervals. Then we'd collect them, we'd replace the yellow sticky trap, and then we'd count both the adults and also the predators on the same sticky card. And so a couple of observations that you can make from this figure. So first, when we put these out in April, adults were already present. And in some cases, we collected many adults on these sticky traps. And so if we were looking to detect that first emergence, we were probably too late. So next year, we're looking to put traps out a bit earlier. And so this is likely that first generation. So this is around 200 to 250 growing degree days. We saw this first bump in adults. And then there is a smaller, but another presence of adults here later in July. And so in addition to these patterns collecting the number of adults, Kathleen and her team also made a really interesting observation in that this first emergence of adults in the spring occurred before they had observed American elm leafing out in central Ohio. And so there was Siberian and Japanese elm that were out. And so this first generation likely was using those non-native species rather than our Native American elm, which is really interesting. So we also tracked a subset of trees for the presence of larvae and feeding damage. And overall, what we tended to see was that feeding damage caused by early instar larvae was observed throughout many of the plantings. But we never really observed substantial defoliation. And so many leaves with this zigzag damage were present throughout the season, and oftentimes we couldn't find a larvae or we didn't see a cocoon. And so we're working to quantify the amount of damage that we're seeing among trees, as well as how often larvae continued to grow through those instars or how often they disappeared, leaving just that zigzag pattern. Because these abandoned feeding galleries could indicate either predation or the larvae was disturbed and somehow fell off the tree. So knowing the amount of that among trees would be helpful to understand what's going on here within the plantings. So stay tuned for that. And then lastly, I'm really interested in predators and predator communities. And so we also looked at this aspect this summer using the yellow sticky traps, and then of course following some bagged and unbagged larvae. And so while the students were doing these surveys, there were many instances where they observed predators on the leaves. So this is just one example of what that looked like perhaps. And so here on this leaf, you can see a lady beetle larvae that was present. Really hard to see because it's in a shadow, but there's an assassin bug here. Assassin bugs and lady beetles, both larvae and adults, were common throughout the plantings. And you can also see here there's a summer cocoon. And so we know that predators are around. They're present even on the trees with EZS activity. And so one hypothesis that we might have is, if we have these robust populations of natural enemies within an area, it's possible that they could provide effective long-term control, perhaps more so than even insecticide usage. So from my standpoint, this is a really interesting avenue to continue to explore. And so we're still looking at the predator data from the sticky cards. We had a lot of sticky cards counting a lot of different arthropod predator groups. And so far we've been focusing on July in particular, as we're sorting through the data and crunching some preliminary numbers, simply because we observed more larvae feeding on the leaves during that time. And so that's where we're starting. And so here's just some raw data on numbers of lady beetles and spiders among the different trees that we surveyed. So these are both really common predator groups that we found on the sticky cards, and they're clearly present within the orchards. Here's a photo of one of the bagged leaves or bagged branches. And so what we did was I had the students identify an EZS larvae feeding on adjacent branches. And so they would flag both of those branches and then put this mesh bag over one and then follow both of those larvae over time. And they kept the bags on. And in one case, this one example that I have shown here, the larvae completed development, emerged as an adult, and laid eggs within the bag. And so what you're seeing here in this photo is that many of those eggs that they laid hatched. And the larvae were feeding on all the leaves that were bagged within that branch. And so this is an example of what like heavy defoliation might look like, which we really didn't see throughout the rest of the planting. And so although, of course, this is just a single observation, right? So we have an N of 1 here, but it's really interesting. And it raises some questions about what predators might be feeding on. And so perhaps predators are not only feeding on larvae, which is what I was sort of thinking before this, but they may also be feeding on the eggs, which could also contribute to population control. So in my opinion, this is a really interesting observation worth further exploration. And hopefully we can continue doing this next summer and replicate this more substantially. So do more paired contrast, bagged and unbagged, to see if this is perhaps a more general pattern than this isolated observation. Okay, and so to end here, I wanted to talk about what you could do to help. And so first, monitoring and reporting of EZS populations is really important right now for a couple of reasons. One, we think populations are likely more widespread than we know, mainly because it's difficult to see these low density populations and the defoliation that they're creating. And so as larvae are growing as well, they might be removing that characteristic zigzag pattern. And so we really need to know where this insect is in order to think about what we can do to control it. And so report observations of suspected EZS infestations, that's the insect, or the feeding damage. You can do that by contacting your local extension office, Department of Ag, or Natural Resource Office. The routes of reporting are different based on the state, and so I would explore some of these options first. Alternatively, you could report through the Great Lakes Early Detection Network app on your phone. The other thing we need is to be considerate about limiting the movement of this insect. And so this can include trees or tree material that are coming from an infested region or that show signs of being infested. Perhaps what might be more challenging is spreading the winter cocoons or the summer cocoons. So if the summer cocoons are attached on objects that you're moving, or if the winter cocoons are in soil of potted plants, just be mindful of assessing and looking for damage and checking before moving any material outside of an infested region. Okay, so with that, I'd really like to thank the EZS working group for their support, particularly Kelly Oaten and Kathleen Knight, but also others that I've been working with, Tom Macy, Rich Fraser, and March Hitchcox. And then lastly, I'd like to thank my field team for collecting all of the exciting data this summer, Jesse, Megan, Ceciette, and Cassian, and particularly Jesse for leading the field crew every week. So thank you so much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and there's my contact information. Feel free to reach out after today as well.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. We do have a few questions that have come up. So the first one that I'm seeing is asking, how do you distinguish Elm Zigzag sawfly from native ones that feed on prunus species?
Oh, that's a good question. So it would be challenging to identify the insect itself without a microscope because the insects are very small. The adult's small, the larvae are even smaller. And so the first key that I would, or the first characteristic that I would key in on to make that distinction is what host you're finding the damage on. And so if you're seeing the damage on an elm species, likely Elm Zigzag sawfly, if you're seeing that zigzag feeding on a prunus, so cherry, plum, peach, not Elm Zigzag sawfly, likely this other group of native species. So I would start with the host and go from there. If you do have a larvae or an adult, you're welcome to send it in for identification. So for example, OSU has a pest clinic. We accept samples from the public and other agencies, and we'll do identifications as well.
And for those of you in Indiana, we also have the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab that will do the same.
Mhm. Yeah, so if you suspect that you have EZS or you're seeing damage, I would err on the side of caution and either report it, report the feeding damage, the insect. It's better to err on the side of caution, I would say, than to brush it off. We want to know where the populations are.
So the next question that came up when you were showing pictures of the cocoon, someone mentioned the picture shows a winter cocoon on a leaf, so not all
Hmm.
cocoons appear in the soil, correct?
That is a good question. Yeah. So it is our understanding that they drop down and go to the soil. Now, when we're exploring their biology, we've been rearing them in the lab in some cases. And so it's possible that that photo came from a situation that was not natural. But our understanding is that they drop to the soil. And then once they're in the soil, then they form their cocoon. It's really hard to find the winter cocoons in the soil. I've looked for them. I'm also really interested in what might be talking about predator communities. They may be exposed to a whole separate community of predators when they're in the soil within those winter cocoons. And so that's also something I'm interested in exploring. But yeah, I think for the most part, you're going to find them in the soil.
So we had two questions that are basically asking the same thing. One
Mhm.
is, have there been any suspected but not confirmed sites in Indiana and in Michigan yet?
Not that I'm aware of. So those do not come through me. And so it's possible that there have been reported feeding damage, but no confirmed insect. I am not sure about that. But this map that I showed today was updated like a couple of days ago. So as of a few days last week, there have not been any confirmed reportings in either Indiana or Michigan.
All right, our next question we have is, do you have any thoughts on the most and least susceptible elm species?
That's a good question. I don't know. So I did share that table of host species. And so it seems like EZS feeding has been detected on a variety of different hosts, and there are some differences among states. And so I think that is something that could be explored further, particularly given we had this observation that that first emergence of adults in the spring, our American elm was not leafed out at the time. And so that presumably that population was supported via non-native species. But as far as, whether they have a preference when all or when more than one elm species are present within the landscape, I don't know. But that would be really interesting to explore further.
Yeah, I think our last question we have here then is for natural area managers. It looks like removing non-native elms could help interrupt that first generation then.
That's an interesting hypothesis. I think we would need to see if this is a consistent pattern across a few years, or how regionally consistent this pattern is. So are folks in other states also seeing that there's this mismatch? But potentially that is a thought that crossed my mind and I think would be worth exploring further. Yeah, there's a lot we still don't know about this insect.
All right, that looks like all the questions we have. Just a couple observations. Someone pointed out it looks like a couple of people on iNaturalist submitted a potential sighting in Michigan. Um,
Okay.
I know that at least in Indiana, I have not yet received any reports of Elm Zigzag sawfly being sighted, but of course,
Mhm.
once we get to spring, that could change very easily.
Yeah, I think it's flying under the radar right now. So I think we're gonna see that map light up here soon. That's my hypothesis. But yeah, it's interesting that a lot of reports, there have been other reports in addition to that first report from Quebec. Others have also come through iNaturalist. So that's a great idea to keep an eye on that platform to see what folks are spotting out in nature.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions pop up. So, Kayla, thank you for sharing your time with us. That was really interesting and hopefully really helpful to a lot of us. I know that as we begin to see this insect enter our states. Again, I just want to reiterate, we will be offering CEUs with this. So if you have any questions on that, please feel free to contact me and I'll make sure that we get those to you. And with that, thank you, Kayla, and everybody. You have a great rest of your week.